Captain Eli Jennings had sailed the North Atlantic for nearly 3 decades. Yet the thickening twilight fog encircling the Siren's lure made him as uneasy as a green deckhand. The old salt said that when the sea spoke, wise men listened. Tonight, it murmured with a sibilant intensity that prickled the back of his neck. The Siren's lure was a sturdy vessel, her timbers seasoned with salt and storm, her sails patchworked from years of mending. Her crew was a mix of grizzled veterans and eager young sailors, each man a patch in the quilt of seafaring brotherhood. But as the ship ventured closer to the infamous Bermuda Triangle, an uncharacteristic tension knotted the air. "Steady as she goes, Mr. Harrow," Captain Eli called to his first mate, who gripped the wheel with knuckles whiter than the crests of the waves. "Aye, Captain. But there's something queer about this mist," Mr. Harrow replied, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the water slapping against the hull. The fog rolled over the ocean in ghostly tendrils, so dense that the bow disappeared from view. The lantern swung gently, casting eerie shadows that danced across the deck. Sailors muttered uneasily among themselves, casting wary glances at the churning sea. The usual creaks and groans of the ship seemed louder, more ominous, as if the Siren's lured herself sensed the approaching peril. As night fell, the whispers began. At first, they were mistaken for the wind singing through the rigging, a common enough sound on any ship. But as the hours passed, the whispers grew clearer, more articulate, and undeniably human. "Johann!" The sea hissed around the rudder. "Alfred!" It murmured past the mainmast. The crew stiffened, each man hearing his name uttered by the unseen lips of the ocean. Old Mr. Peabody, the ship's cook and a sailor of 40 years, crossed himself and clutched his rosary, his lips moving silently in prayer. "It's the sea spirits," he whispered to Tommy, the cabin boy, who clung to the galley door, wide-eyed. "They say when the spirits speak your name, they weave your fate with the waters." Tommy's face paled, but he nodded, taking in every word. He had joined the ship in search of adventure, intrigued by tales of the deep blue. Now, confronted with the reality of those tales, his heart hammered against his ribcage like a drum. Captain Eli stood firm at the stern, his gaze piercing through the impenetrable fog. He had heard the legends, of course, tales of ships swallowed whole by the sea, of crews gone mad with fear, whispering waters that promised doom. But he had always believed those stories to be just that, stories. Now, as fear threaded its icy fingers through his crew, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of ethereal voices, creating a symphony of dread that seemed to emanate from the very depth of the ocean. Eli's seasoned heart raced as he realized the whispers did not merely mimic the sounds of human voices. They spoke in tongues long lost to the sea, languages of ancient mariners whose ships had foundered in watery graves. "We must not listen," Captain Eli shouted above the din, his voice booming across the deck. "Cover your ears and focus on your tasks. The sea tests us, tries to lure us into madness. Stand firm." But even as he spoke, a new sound cut through the clamor, a mournful wail that seemed both far away and terrifyingly close. The men froze, their tasks forgotten, as the haunting cry underscored their deepest fears. "Something's out there," Mr. Harrow murmured, squinting into the mist. Just then, a colossal shadow loomed ahead, massive and monolithic. The crew gasped as the outline of a ghostly galleon emerged from the fog, its tattered sails billowing in a non-existent wind. Its decks were spectral, deserted, a floating tombstone marking the passage of souls lost to the abyss. The vision lasted but a moment before dissolving back into the mist from which it had come. But its message was clear. They were not alone in these haunted waters. Captain Eli gripped the ship's wheel, his resolve steeling him against the night's dark terrors. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it head-on. The whispers of the waves a chilling prelude to the horrors that awaited in the dark, roiling deep. Captain Eli Jennings had faced many a peril at sea, but the apparition of the ghostly galleon had shaken him to his core. Now, as the midnight watch was set, an oppressive silence hung over the Siren's Lure. The usual nocturnal chorus of creaking wood and flapping sails seemed muted, as if the sea itself held its breath. First, mate Mr. Harrow stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the horizon where the fog bank lay like a heavy shroud on the ocean. The air was thick with salt and unease. Even the ship seemed to move reluctantly through the water, each wave slapping against the hull with a hesitance that was almost sentient. Suddenly, a chill wind swept across the deck, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible voice. Mr. Harrow strained his ears, trying to discern any words in the ghostly whispers, but they slipped away as quickly as they had come, leaving a cold emptiness in their wake. From the crow's nest, the lookout, a young sailor named Finn, gave a startled cry. "There's something out there." His voice trembled as it carried down to the deck. Mr. Harrow grabbed his spyglass and peered into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but the inky blackness of the night sea. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he glimpsed a figure standing at the very edge of the bow. It was a shadowy silhouette, human in shape, but ethereal in substance, as if composed of the mist itself. "Who goes there?" Mr. Harrow shouted, his voice carrying across the ship. But the figure made no response. It simply stood, gazing into the depths of the ocean as though mesmerized by the dark waters. Captain Eli, alerted by the lookout's cry, joined Mr. Harrow at the helm. His eyes narrowed as he observed the silent watcher. "That's no member of my crew," he muttered under his breath. He made his way towards the figure, his footsteps firm and deliberate. The crew members paused in their tasks, watching as their captain approached the mysterious presence. As Eli drew closer, the temperature seemed to drop, the air around him growing colder with each step. "Identify yourself," Eli commanded, stopping just a few paces away from the figure. The shape remained unmoved, its features indiscernible in the low light. Eli reached out a hand, a part of him dreading the contact. His fingers brushed through the figure, feeling nothing but the cold mist. The silhouette slowly turned its head, facing him directly. For a moment, Eli thought he saw a pair of eyes, as deep and black as the ocean abyss, staring back at him. Then, with a gust of wind, the figure dissipated into the fog, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. The crew was left in stunned silence, the implications of what they had just witnessed dawning on them. Ghosts, spirits, the cursed souls of drowned sailors. Stories they had all heard but never believed. Now, faced with the inexplicable, even the most skeptical among them felt the stirrings of fear. Eli stood at the bow, gazing out into the fog. The encounter had lasted only moments, but it had changed something fundamental in the air. The whispers seemed louder now, more insistent. Unseen eyes seemed to watch from the rolling waves, and every man aboard felt the weight of those gazes. As the ship continued its journey, the crew moved about their duties with a newfound wariness. The ocean had always been a place of both wonder and danger, but now it felt like a living entity, aware and intent on their demise. Captain Eli, however, sensed a message in the night's eerie events. The sea was testing them, challenging their resolve, their sanity. He knew that they needed to remain strong, to support each other as a crew united not just by their journey, but by the shared experience of the supernatural. Back at the helm, Mr. Harrow kept a vigilant watch, his eyes occasionally drifting to the spot where the figure had stood. He knew that whatever secrets the ocean held, the Siren's Lure had brushed against one of them tonight. And as the sea whispered and the fog clung to the ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that their voyage was far from over, and that the true test of their courage had only just begun. The spectral encounter at the bow had left the crew of the Siren's Lure with a sense of foreboding that clung to them like the damp sea air. Below deck, the atmosphere was even more stifling, as if the ship herself was holding her breath, waiting for the next unnatural occurrence to reveal itself. As the night wore on, a strange occurrence began to unfold in the lower levels of the ship. Crew members reported finding small puddles of seawater in the corridors, far from any natural source, like leaky hull planking or condensation. These puddles were perfectly round, as if deliberately placed, and no matter how many times they were mopped up, they reappeared, each time closer to the ship's core. The ship's carpenter, a burly man named Mason, was the first to notice the pattern. It's as if the sea's creeping in, not through cracks, but through sheer will, he murmured, eyeing the water warily as he wrung out his mop for the third time that night. As Mason set about his task, the laughter started. It was low at first, barely audible over the creak of the ship and the slap of waves against the hull, a soft, mocking chuckle that seemed to come from the water itself. Mason straightened up, his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. The laughter grew louder, more distinct, a sound no man aboard could deny. Captain Eli, roused from his restless contemplation by reports of the laughter, descended into the hold with Mr. Harrow and several crew members. Each step took them deeper into the bowels of the ship, where the air was cooler and the sense of encroaching dread stronger. They paused at the sight of another puddle, this one larger than the others, its surface smooth and undisturbed. Eli bent down, touching the icy water, then stood, his expression grim. "This isn't just water from the sea," he announced. "It's as cold as the deep ocean trenches. It's like it's been brought here with a purpose." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the implications of the captain's words hanging heavily in the air. The laughter echoed again, bouncing off the wooden walls, mocking their fear. "This isn't natural," Eli continued, his voice a low growl of frustration and command. "We're dealing with something that doesn't abide by the laws of man or nature. We need to find its source, or none of us will see home again." Armed with lanterns and makeshift weapons, they began a thorough search of the ship. The laughter seemed to move with them, always one step ahead, leading them on a chase through the cramped quarters below deck. It was during this search that they came upon a locked door that none could remember ever having been there. Mason, his hand steady despite the eerie atmosphere, set to work on the lock. As he picked at the mechanism, the laughter crescendoed into a deafening cacophony, as if whatever lay behind that door was delighted by their proximity. With a final twist, the lock clicked open, and the door swung inward with a groan. The room beyond was pitch black, colder even than the corridors outside. The laughter stopped abruptly as the lantern light revealed the room's contents. Nothing. It was completely empty except for another puddle, this one perfectly centered in the room. As they entered, the temperature dropped further, their breaths visible in the lantern light. The water in the puddle began to ripple, as though something beneath the surface disturbed it. Then, from the depths of the water, the laughter resumed, not from around them, but below them, emanating from the puddle itself. The men backed away, but Captain Eli stood firm, his eyes fixed on the rippling water. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice echoing off the walls. "What do you want from us?" But no answer came, only laughter, deeper and more menacing than before. The water rippled more violently, and as they watched in horror, a face began to form on the surface of the water, a ghostly visage twisted in an expression of malevolent glee. Without warning, the face dissolved and the water stilled. The room felt suddenly warmer, the oppressive cold lifting as if whatever had been there had withdrawn, satisfied with their terror. Captain Eli, his face set in hard lines, turned to his crew. "We're not alone on this ship, but we're not helpless either. We'll set watches, keep the lanterns burning. Whatever this is, it's playing with us, testing us. But we won't be played for fools." As they filed out of the room, Each man felt the weight of their captain's words, and a new resolve hardened in their hearts. They would face this terror together, as sailors had always faced the unknown and the unfathomable, united by the bonds of the sea and the strength of their will. With the break of dawn, the Siren's lure seemed momentarily untouched by the spectral horrors of the night. However, the respite was brief as the horizon swiftly darkened with the ominous approach of a tempest. Captain Eli Jennings watched the gathering storm clouds with a knotted brow, sensing the unnatural silence that pressed down upon the ocean. "Prepare for rough weather," he called out to his crew, his voice carrying the weight of both command and an unspoken dread. The sailors moved quickly, their actions driven by the need to secure the ship and a desperate, unvoiced hope that the physical battle with the storm might dispel the shadow of the supernatural that loomed over them. As the first gusts of wind hit, the Siren's lure began to pitch and roll. The sea, which had been eerily calm throughout their ordeal, now roared to life with ferocious intensity. Waves, tall as mountains and dark as the deepest abyss, crashed against the ship, each impact a blow against the wooden hull that held the lives of Eli and his men. Mr. Harrow, steadfast at the helm, struggled to keep the ship on course, his eyes squinting through the rain that whipped horizontally across the deck. Lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the churning waters and, for fleeting moments, revealing disturbing forms swimming just below the surface. Eli saw them too, a glimpse of scales that shone with an unnatural luminescence, bodies that twisted and turned with serpentine grace. His heart pounded as he realized these were no ordinary sea creatures. They had the countenance of nightmares, the kind whispered about by old mariners who spoke of sea monsters guarding cursed waters. "Keep her steady, Mr. Harrow. Don't let her be drawn off course," Eli shouted over the howling wind. His crew clung to whatever they could, their faces etched with lines of concentration and fear. Among them, young Tommy, the cabin boy, stood resolute, a determined look in his eyes as he battled alongside men twice his age. Amidst the chaos, the ship lurched violently as a monstrous wave hit, tilting her perilously. From below deck, a loud crack resonated, followed by the rush of water. "We've been breached," Mason the carpenter yelled, emerging soaked from the hatch. Without hesitation, Captain Eli and several crew members descended into the bowels of the ship. Water pooled rapidly in the lower compartments, threatening to destabilize their already precarious situation. With lanterns swinging wildly, casting eerie shadows on the water-soaked walls, they worked frantically to patch the breach. The laughter echoed once more, barely audible over the storm's fury. It seemed mocking, delighting in their plight. Eli's gaze swept the dimly lit hold, half expecting the spectral face to emerge from the swirling water around their ankles. "Focus on the task at hand," he roared, his voice carrying the edge of leadership necessary in such dire moments. The men rallied, their efforts redoubled, and slowly, the influx of water was stemmed. Back on deck, the storm raged on, each thunderclap and flash of lightning a testament to the battle between the natural and supernatural forces surrounding the Siren's lure. Just when the storm seemed at its peak, the clouds abruptly parted, and a strange, almost unnatural calm settled over the sea. The eerie stillness that followed was suffocating. Eli, soaked to the bone but resolute, surveyed the horizon. The creatures had disappeared with the storm, but he knew this was no victory. It was a reprieve, a moment to catch their breath before the next ordeal. As the men regrouped, their expressions spoke of both relief and residual fear. They had survived the storm, but at a cost. The ship was damaged, their nerves frayed, and the deep had shown them horrors that would haunt their dreams. "We hold course," Eli announced, his voice firm despite the fatigue that pulled at his limbs. "We mend what's broken, brace what's weak, and keep our eyes wide open. Whatever this voyage has in store, we face it as we always have, together." The crew nodded, their resolve hardened by their captain's leadership. They returned to their duties, each man silently pondering the same unspoken question. What lay ahead in the uncharted waters, where the maps ended and the legends began. The Siren's Lure sailed onward, her lanterns glowing like beacons against the gathering dusk. The sea whispered once more, but now its voice was drowned out by the sound of men working, determined to defy the dark waters that sought to claim them. After battling the storm and witnessing the deep's haunting creatures, the crew of the Siren's Lure welcomed the sight of land, though its sudden appearance on their charts and in their path was as mysterious as the fog that had first enshrouded them. Captain Eli Jennings eyed the island with suspicion. It was not marked on any of their maps, a patch of verdant green that seemed both a haven and a trap. "Keep sharp, men. We're not out of unknown waters yet," Captain Eli cautioned as they neared the shore. The island was covered in thick, lush forest that stretched towards a sky ominously void of birds. The absence of life sounds, no calls of wildlife or rustling of leaves, was unsettling. The ship anchored off the coast, and a small party including Eli, Mr. Harrow, and Mason armed themselves before rowing ashore. The beach was eerily silent, the usual lap of waves against the shore muted, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. As they trekked inland, the ground beneath their feet was spongy, the air filled with a palpable tension. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon the first statue. It was a figure of a man, life-sized and incredibly detailed, so much so that at first glance Mr. Harrow stepped back, thinking it a living person. The statue's face was twisted in an expression of horror, mouth agape as if caught mid-scream. "This place," Mason murmured, "it's cursed." More statues appeared as they ventured further, each depicting a similar visage of terror. Men, women, even children, frozen in time, each face etched with an anguish that suggested a sudden and terrifying end. The whispers began softly, almost imperceptible amongst the rustle of their movements. But as they moved deeper into the island, the whispers grew louder, clearer. Unlike the whispers from the ocean, these seemed to rise directly from the earth, a chorus of voices pleading, warning, despairing. Captain Eli halted, his hand raised for silence. The whispers coalesced into a voice, singular and sorrowful. "Leave this place," it moaned, the words vibrating through the ground and into their bones. Ignoring the warnings, they pressed on, drawn by a morbid curiosity and the need to understand this new threat. The center of the island was marked by a large clearing, at the heart of which stood an ancient tree, its trunk wide and branches sprawling. The whispers were loudest here, emanating from the tree itself. "Record this, all of it," Eli instructed Tommy, who had insisted on coming ashore and carried with him a small journal. As Tommy scribbled down every detail, the whispers grew agitated, swirling around them like a gust of wind. Suddenly, the ground shook, and from the base of the tree, a fissure split the earth, releasing a burst of cold air that smelled of deep sea and decay. The men staggered back, clutching at their throats, gasping against the stench. "This island," Eli gasped, "it's alive." From the fissure, a shadow began to form, coalescing into a humanoid shape. It was darker than the night, a void that seemed to pull at the light around it. The shape looked at them, and where its eyes should have been, there was nothing but an impenetrable darkness. "You cannot stay," it whispered, a voice like the tide pulling back from the shore. "You cannot leave." "What are you?" Eli demanded, his voice steady despite the fear that clenched his gut. "I am the Guardian," the shadow replied, "the protector of the deep. This island is the barrier between your world and what lies beneath. You bring chaos with your presence. Leave before the chaos consumes you." The air around them thickened, pressing in with an intensity that threatened to suffocate. The statues around the clearing seemed to watch, their stone eyes filled with an unspoken warning. Eli took a step back, realizing the gravity of their situation. "We will leave," he promised, not out of fear but out of respect for the balance they had unwittingly disturbed. As they retreated to their boat, the whispers followed, a murmur of voices that faded only when they reached the beach. Glancing back, Eli saw the shadow watching them from the tree lean, its form blurring and fading into the foliage. Back aboard the Siren's Lure, the crew awaited anxiously. "Set sail," Eli ordered, his voice carrying a new weight. As they pulled away from the island, the fog rolled in again, enveloping them, obscuring the cursed land from view as if it had never existed. But they had seen enough to know that some places were meant to remain untouched, secrets that were not theirs to uncover. As the island disappeared into the mist, the whispers finally ceased, leaving only the sound of the waves against the hull. A reminder that the sea kept its mysteries close, revealing them only to those who dared to listen. The crew of the Siren's Lure sailed away from the mysterious island in silence, each man haunted by the statues, the whispers, and the shadowy guardian they had encountered. Night fell with a suddenness that seemed unnatural, as though the darkness itself was part of the curse they had disturbed. Below deck, Captain Eli Jennings sat in his cramped quarters, replaying the events of the day. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had brought something back with them, an unseen force that now lingered in every shadow. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Harrow stepped into the room, his face tense and drawn. "Captain," he said, his voice low, "Finn has gone missing." Eli's heart sank. Finn was young, but capable, known for his cheerful disposition that brightened the ship even on the darkest days. The idea that he would vanish willingly was unthinkable. But Eli knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary disappearance. "When was he last seen?" Eli asked, standing up, his hand instinctively reaching for his lantern. "Just after sundown," Mr. Harrow replied. "He was with Mason, helping patch the deck." Mason turned his back for a moment, and when he looked again, Finn was gone. "No one saw him leave." Eli nodded, his face grim. "Gather the men. We'll search every corner of this ship." The crew assembled, their faces taut with fear and exhaustion, yet determined to find their missing comrade. Armed with lanterns and ropes, they scoured the Siren's Lure from bow to stern, searching every inch of the ship. The lanterns swung in the darkness, casting eerie, flickering shadows that seemed to shift and twist on their own. The deeper they ventured below deck, the colder the air became, the temperature plummeting with each step. It was as if the darkness itself exhaled an icy breath that wrapped around their bodies, making their skin prickle and their bones ache. As they reached the lower hold, the whispers returned, soft, insistent, like the murmurs from the island, but somehow darker, more malevolent. They seemed to seep from the walls, curling around the men's ears, brushing against their minds in a way that felt invasive and unnatural. "Eli," a voice called, soft and pleading. "Captain Eli, help me." It was Finn's voice. Eli stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. The voice was unmistakable, but it held a note of desperation, of fear that was foreign to the normally jovial sailor. "Finn," Eli called, straining to pinpoint the direction of the voice. "Help me, please." The voice echoed from the depths of the ship, pulling them further into the dark, silent corridors. The lantern light flickered, and Eli's pulse quickened as he sensed something watching them, lurking just out of sight. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive, as if it were thickening, solidifying around them. Finally, they reached a small, cramped compartment that held supplies. The door was slightly ajar, and from within came the faint, terrified whimpers of Finn. Eli signaled for silence, then slowly pushed the door open. The room was dim, but in the far corner, curled up and trembling, was Finn. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his skin pale, his lips moving soundlessly, as though he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. "Finn," Eli whispered, kneeling beside him and placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right. You're safe now." But Finn's eyes didn't register Eli's presence. Instead, he continued to mutter, his words barely audible. "They're in the water. I saw them, faces, hundreds of them. Calling me, they want me to join them." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Eli's grip tightened on Finn's shoulder as he tried to shake the young sailor back to reality. "Finn, listen to me. You're with us now. Whatever you saw, it's gone. We're taking you back to your bunk," Eli said firmly, though his own voice wavered. But Finn only shook his head, his expression one of utter despair. It's not gone, Captain. They're here, all around us. The island. It didn't let us go. We're still in its grasp. The men fell silent, a chill washing over them as Finn's words settled in. The island's curse, the whispers, the shadows, had indeed followed them. And now, it seemed, they were caught between the realms of the living and the dead, a purgatory where the boundaries of reality were fraying. As they helped Finn to his feet, he suddenly went rigid, his eyes rolling back, his body convulsing as though he were in the throes of some unseen force. He collapsed to the floor, and a low, guttural moan escaped his lips. The moan became words, though they were not Finn's voice. It was deep, hollow, resonating with the timbre of something ancient and unspeakably old. You trespassed, you awakened us, and now you belong to us? The voice echoed through the room, filling the small space with a weight that pressed down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. Finn's eyes fluttered open, but they were blank, devoid of life. For a moment, he seemed to look through them, beyond them, to a place no living man could comprehend. Then, with a sudden clarity, he whispered, "Run." The lanterns flickered again, and the whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, as though dozens of unseen beings were closing in. The men needed no further urging. They half-carried, half-dragged Finn up the stairs, their only thought to escape the oppressive darkness that seemed to grow thicker with each step. Back on deck, the cold eased, but the atmosphere remained charged with fear. The crew gathered around Finn, who was laid gently on a makeshift cot, his breathing shallow and irregular. His skin had taken on an ashen hue, his eyes flickering beneath closed lids as if he were seeing things beyond their reach. Eli stood over him, his mind racing. They were in uncharted waters, literally and figuratively. The natural laws of the world no longer seemed to apply, and they had become pawns in a game they couldn't understand. In the silence, Tommy, the young cabin boy, approached Eli with wide, terrified eyes. "Captain," he whispered, "is it true? Are we cursed?" Eli hesitated, unwilling to lie to the boy, yet unable to crush his spirit with the grim reality. "We're facing something no sailor has ever faced, Tommy," he said softly. "But we're strong, and we're together. Whatever this curse is, we'll fight it." As the night deepened, the men took turns watching over Finn, who remained feverish and delirious, his muttering broken by occasional cries of terror. Each man was left alone with his thoughts, each silently questioning if they would ever escape the grip of the island's curse. When Eli's turn came, he sat beside Finn, studying his haunted expression. He wondered what horrors had seared themselves into the young man's mind, what visions lay beneath those closed lids. His own thoughts drifted back to the statues on the island, their faces frozen in terror. He realized now that those were not just sculptures. They were warnings, mementos of those who had fallen prey to the curse that had claimed the island. As dawn approached, a strange peace settled over Finn. His breathing slowed, his body relaxing as if released from an invisible grip. He opened his eyes and looked at Eli with a clarity Eli had not seen since they found him. "The voices," Finn whispered, his voice faint but steady. "They said they'll come for all of us, one by one, unless—" Eli leaned forward, desperate to catch every word. "Unless what, Finn?" Finn's eyes clouded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "Unless we give them what they want. A life. For a life." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Eli knew that Finn's mind had been marked, tainted by something beyond understanding. The thought of sacrifice clawed at his conscience, but he pushed it aside, unwilling to accept that it was their only option. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Eli knew one thing for certain. The curse of the island was far from over, and the shadows that had followed them were growing bolder, hungrier. They had merely brushed against the edges of a nightmare, and the true horror was yet to reveal itself. As dawn painted the sky with strokes of crimson and gold, Captain Eli Jennings stood at the helm of the Siren's Lure, his gaze locked on the horizon. The night's revelations had left a palpable shadow over the crew, each man grappling with the knowledge of the spectral forces that not only followed them, but claimed one of their own as a voice for their cryptic warnings. The morning air was brisk, the sea relatively calm, but the atmosphere aboard was anything but peaceful. Eli could feel the weight of every haunted glance from his crew, their eyes darting to the churning waters below and then away, as if fearing they might glimpse those ghastly, whispering faces Finn had described. "Set full sail," Eli commanded, his voice carrying across the deck. "We make for the nearest port. We end this, break this curse, by facing it on solid ground." Mr. Harrow nodded, setting the crew to work with a renewed sense of urgency. They raised the sails, the canvas snapping taut as the wind caught them, propelling the ship forward. The Siren's Lure cut through the water, her bow slicing a frothy path through the ocean as if she too were eager to escape the haunting depths. Below deck, Finn rested, his condition stabilized but his mind troubled. The young sailor had seen too much, the veil between the known world and the abyss too thinly stretched. Eli visited him, sitting by his side, watching the troubled expressions that flickered across his face like shadows. "Finn," Eli spoke softly, placing a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "We're heading for land. Hold on, lad. Just hold on." Finn's eyes fluttered open, the dim light of the cabin glinting off his pale face. "Captain," he whispered hoarsely. "The voices, they're quieter now. But they're not gone. They are waiting." Eli's jaw tightened. "Let them wait," he replied sternly. "We'll be ready for them." As the ship sailed closer to civilization, strange occurrences seemed to wane, but the tension never fully dissipated. The crew was silent, their usual banter replaced by low, urgent conversations, their faces etched with the strain of constant vigilance. 3 days later, the Siren's Lure docked at a bustling port. The sight of land brought a visible relief to the crew, but the shadow of their ordeal followed them like a dark cloud. As they disembarked, Eli made arrangements for Finn to be taken to a hospital, hoping that the doctors could heal the wounds no one could see. With Finn cared for, Eli gathered his remaining crew at a local inn, their faces weary but determined. "Men," he began, his voice low and compelling, "we've faced something on this voyage that'll mark us all till our dying days. But we face it together. We'll find help here, answers maybe, and put an end to this curse." The crew nodded, their resolve hardening. Eli spent the next days consulting with local historians, delving into old maritime logs and records of the region. It was during a late-night session in the dusty back room of the Maritime Library that he found it, a record of an island, unmarked on any map, known to local sailors as the Whispering Isle. According to legend, the island appeared to those who were already cursed, its guardian a spectral entity bound to protect the secrets of the deep. The log spoke of rituals and sacrifices, dark bargains made to appease the island's curse. Eli's heart sank as he read. The solution was grim, the price high. But as captain, his duty was to his crew, to their survival. He could not let them fall prey to the abyss. Gathering his men, Eli shared his findings. "There's a way to end this," he declared, his eyes sweeping over his crew. "It's not without risk, and it's not without cost. But it's our only chance to rid ourselves of this darkness." The men exchanged glances, their faces set in grim determination. They were sailors, familiar with the capricious nature of the sea and the darker folklore that accompanied their trade. They nodded, each man silently agreeing to stand with their captain, come what may. That night, under the cloak of darkness, they performed the ritual as outlined in the ancient logs. Words were spoken, offerings made, and promises given. The air shimmered with a palpable energy, the sea beyond the dock roiling as if disturbed by their actions. As the ritual reached its climax, the air suddenly cleared, the oppressive weight that had hung over them lifting like a fog at sunrise. A deep, resonant silence followed, profound and complete. Eli felt it then, a peace he hadn't known since the voyage began. He turned to his crew, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the ritual fire, each man's eyes reflecting a mix of relief and sorrow. "We've done it," he said simply, the burden of command lifting slightly. "Let's go home." The crew of the Siren's Lure returned to their ship, the darkness of the past days seeming like a distant nightmare. As they set sail once more, the sea welcomed them, the familiar sound of the waves a gentle reassurance that they had passed through the shadows and into the light. Finn recovered, the shadows in his eyes replaced by a cautious hope. The whispers, the faces in the water, the chilling touch of the abyss, all faded into memory, the details blurring like ink in water. Captain Eli Jennings stood at the helm, his eyes on the horizon, a soft smile playing on his lips. The sea was once again a place of wonder and mystery, but the darkness had receded, pushed back by the light of their courage and their resolve. As the Siren's Lure cut through the waves, heading towards the golden glow of the setting sun, Eli knew that this voyage, like all great tales of the sea, would be told and retold, a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknowable, and the enduring strength of those who dare to sail into the dark waters.